Record. Ooh, I had to request record permission from the meeting host. Do I have permission to record? It said I have to. You're already recording? Wonderful. That's why it was requesting permission. Okay, so let's talk about HTML, the language of the interwebs. So as we've learned a little bit earlier when we were talking about HTTP, some of us were like, I think I know what that means, because you know hypertext markup language is something that you've interacted with for a good chunk of your lives, right? So what is HTML? HTML is a markup language, with a little star, spoken between two computers, shown to users through the lens of a browser, okay? So here's my picture. I tried to like replicate it as best as possible. We have the server on one side. We've been playing with that, right? For the most part, we had, you know, our database living in there. We got Active Record talking to it so that we can build Ruby stuff and talk to Active Record, right? And then from there, on the other side of that, we have the client, and that could be a computer, that can be a phone, that can be a bot, okay? Anything that is going to receive information or communicate with the server on one side is a client, okay? And that's where that communication is happening between the client and the server. And then we see here we have our HTTP gets, and then we get back these little packets that are like 200 OK to be given from the server, okay? So I starred languages because we have a few different languages that exist in the world of technology, okay? And I wanted to break that out a little bit. We've been dealing with programming languages are largely around programming computer systems, okay? And the language we've been utilizing for that is Ruby. Okay, we also have scripting languages, and those are languages that kind of interact more heavily with between programs. And scripting languages we've utilized are JavaScript and Bash. Note that scripting languages are a subset of programming languages, so they're both and, okay? We've also dealt with query languages. We've been dealing with SQL, right? It's a SQL, right? Query language. And now we have markup language, which showed up really horribly here, but markup language we have right now that we're working with is HTML. There's also other ones like XML, SML, those kinds of things, okay? That is a markup language. And then we have a style language, a style sheet language, one of which we're gonna work with is CSS. There are other style sheet languages like TeX, and I can't remember the other one.
Sass one? Is that a thing?
Sass is a, it's a framework that utilizes CSS to build a little more functionality and, like, I would say some object-oriented kind of like functionality for CSS. Good question. Okay, I chose like the wrong color, but HTML is a markup language that separates content from presentation, okay? It provides a set of instructions for a browser to interpret that instruction, okay? So it's a set of instructions, HTML, it's markup setting instructions for a browser to read and interpret to be able to present that content to a user, okay? What HTML is not, it is not easy, okay? It actually requires a level of memorization and understanding of content semantics. So, right, when we're building HTML, it's not just a matter of like throwing a bunch of content in a box and delivering it to a user, right? There's a lot more intent around your understanding of what that content is, being able to provide that information so that any given user at any given level of ability is going to be able to see that information in the same way, or be able to access that information in the same way that the person who created that content intended. Okay, so I retracted from saying see because not everybody is looking at your website through eyes, right? There are many people who are going to be accessing your web page with different kinds of screen readers or other assistive devices, but should still expect to get the same result of like being able to interact with your web page.
So front-end folks are also the guys that are like, hey, I need to make sure this website appears right on an iPad and on iPhone, on a Samsung, on a desktop.
Right. So front-end folks are usually the ones that are really dealing with what set of users are, or what's the audience, what are the different clients that they're going to be interacting with, and how do I make sure that I can accommodate for that array of differentiation. Mm-hmm.
The app sits in like Swift and things. Is that what they're using for front end, and then is it sitting on like their standard back end, like what their website would work on? You know what I mean, for mobile?
So that is a good question. I think when we get into like applications, we're not going to really delve into mobile applications, but the front end of mobile applications have some semblance of like an HTML markup type thing, but they are more detailed and more programmed out for the mobile client itself to package that program and then like compile and run it as the mobile phone needs to do it. It's a bit different than a web application, because a web application is going to be utilizing like a browser-like front end.
If there's not a dedicated app, it's usually just some scalable.
It's usually a web view that's utilizing some variation of HTML translated to a web browser that's being shelled like a mobile app. Those are what you would utilize hybrid mobile apps for, that kind of thing. Okay, so HTML is not easy. It requires memorization, that kind of stuff. It also requires browser specs and understanding the quirks of all the different tools that people are utilizing to access the site that you're building or the application that you're building. Okay. Some words to know. We're going to get into these in more detail, but some words that are going to come up a lot are element. Okay, and there are different types of elements. There are structural elements, semantic elements, form elements, graphic elements, and media elements. These are all different HTML elements that help you interact with the kind of content you want to put forth. And it's really important to utilize the right ones at the right time. We're also going to be dealing with tags. Some are self-closing, meaning, and you'll see why it means that, what that means in a second. But a tag and an element are separate things, but an element encompasses a tag. Okay, you'll see why in a second. Attribute. We've been speaking a little bit about attributes from a programming perspective, but an attribute in a similar format is a property that an HTML element can contain and helps further contextualize what that element is supposed to do. Okay, it's usually something that you'll end up utilizing a lot when we get into CSS and JavaScript. Okay, some are global and some are tag specific. So if we were utilizing an A tag, for example, is anybody familiar with the A tag? Like a link, an anchor tag? Okay, so an anchor tag has a specific amount of attributes that are required in order for that anchor tag to work, like an href. Otherwise, it won't work. There are other global tags that you can use on anything, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can use on any different HTML tag. Okay, content again, different than the presentation, the markup you're creating. And then display types. We're going to talk a lot about block and inline, but there are multiple ways that content is going to be displayed on a page and wrapped around what right now we'll just call a box. Okay, so this is one HTML element. We've all seen this before, right? So you have the opening tag and the closing tag. Again, some tags do not have a closing tag, so you'll just see an opening tag, and then you might see a slash at the end that shows like this is a closed one-line tag. Okay, this attr key and attr val, I put that there so we are all understanding already, like we have keys and value pairs, right? So this is an attribute. It's usually an attribute key equals, and then in a string quote, some attribute value. Okay, you don't comma separate if you have multiple attributes in an HTML tag. You just set them in the opening tag usually.
So what like, can you give like an example?
What does this represent?
Yeah.
Sure.
ID, see what that means.
So I just showed you a tag, right? So if I had, so let's look at an A tag because I already talked about it. Okay, so this is an anchor tag. Okay, an anchor tag I'm talking about specifically is like an anchor, the A representing the A at the beginning and the end of this tag, right? So if I put my link goes here, and then I put
Google.com.
okay, so right now we have this anchor tag. We have one attribute, which is called href. Okay, so the href, the attribute key is href, which means hyperlink reference. So the hyperlink that I'm referring to is this URL. So that's the value. Okay, this is the opening tag. This is the content. And that's the closing tag.
So that's at the link. That's like what the website would say, like some of the verbiage from the website.
This would basically translate to, if I opened it in a browser.
I think we're trying to figure out what. So what you wrote there says my link goes here. What is that? What is that?
You know how you see something in blue and it says whatever, but it's not like HTTP and it takes you there? That's just what.
Okay.
What? That's why I didn't do that?
It's just like an alias for instead of having that link.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why. So I had a broken link. Okay, so this,
Oh, it's a hyperlink.
yes, it's called an anchor tag.
That goes to
Anchor tag,
Google.com.
hyperlinks, and-
This, if I hover over it, if you see at the bottom, it goes to google.com.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so that is one HTML tag. The entire process, like this entire thing, is one HTML element. Okay, that includes an anchor tag with a certain set of content. So tag plus content equals HTML element.
Are there like hundreds of? So
Yes,
what
there
an
is.
attribute called, like that thing?
It's an attribute.
Attributes. How many? There's thousands of attributes.
Not thousands. So let's go back to this. Okay, so we just talked about one HTML element. Okay, great. All right. So before we go into like how many attributes and how many tags there are, let's just talk about like the behavior of an element. Okay, so elements can be related, and we'll talk about what a DOM tree is soon. But when you're looking at an HTML document, you might see things that are indented and living inside the opening and closing of a given tag. And that is seen as one whole HTML element where you have children of that larger tag inside of it. Okay, so in this example here, I have one div HTML tag, okay, and then I have an H1 tag and a P or paragraph tag inside of that div. The H1, header 1, okay, and P is for paragraph, okay? So this H1 and this paragraph tag are children of this div. I named the parent div, okay?
So if whatever is living in those like the carets, the greater than less than signs, that's called a tag. That's considered a tag.
Yeah, so this first part is gonna be the name of the tag, which right now is a div, okay? And then this class equals parent is an attribute. This is a class attribute. Class is one of the global attributes you can use on any tag element or on any tag, okay? And then this one, we have H1. Again, it opens here, closes there, the content's inside. And then opens here, closes here, content's inside. And then the div closes after those two elements. So the entire thing is a sandwich of HTML elements all together. Okay, so things can be parents of other elements, children of other elements, or siblings. So right now, this H1 and this P tag are siblings, okay, because they're living on the same line. They're right next to each other. They're siblings. Okay, this ends up being important when we get into CSS and JavaScript. So your indentation is going to be really important. It's not going to ruin it if you don't have good indentation. It's just going to be horrible for you, human readable, and then harder for you to utilize when you're dealing with CSS and JavaScript, because you're not going to clearly be able to see like who's a parent and a child and a sibling of whom. So keep in mind.
If there wasn't a header, would the paragraph become a child?
If this div class did not
No, if
exist,
there was no H1, if there was no H1 and it would just went right into text.
oh, would this I'm a child content,
Yeah.
if this was here without an H1 tag wrapping it?
No. If like that whole line H1 didn't exist, would the text there become H1, or would it still be?
No. So if, for example, oh, sorry, we'll go backwards. Okay, so if the I'm a child content did not have the H1 wrapping it, like at the beginning and the end.
If that whole line was just.
Okay, and then we just went straight to this paragraph tag.
Does that have to be H1 then, or can it?
No, it can be whatever it wants. But as a developer, you should understand, like, is this a section that needs a heading?
Yeah.
Then if so, this should probably be in a heading tag and not a paragraph tag.
Yeah.
So that's where you start having to like make appropriate decisions for what content should go where and what tags should be utilized.
H1 is basically the title of an essay. Is that fair?
Yeah, that would be appropriate. H1 would usually be like the title of a blog post if there is no other title above it. H1 means it's the first heading. So when you get into semantics around like there's a title of a page, for example, and then there's multiple articles, okay? All those articles will probably be H2s, for example, right? Or it'll be an H1 within a section. So we'll get into like how we semantically organize those things, but that would be those would be the decisions we would need to make.
And there's certain limitations on your ability to format like a header or a paragraph.
So there are limitations on elements, not necessarily on your ability to edit them, but there are like particular attributes that might or might not be available. There are ways that they behave on browsers that might default some certain way that you would just want to keep in mind when you make a decision of like whether to use an H1 tag or a paragraph tag, for example.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I spoke a little bit about attributes. Here are a list of some global attributes that you will be able to utilize on multiple elements. So class, we kind of spoke a little bit about. It's a set of like elements. So if on a given web page you have 3 different articles, right? They're basically doing the same thing, right? So you would expect that they should be represented the same way, right? So you can wrap every single one of those articles in an element, and we actually have an article element, and I would set them as like class, blog post. So all of my blog posts are wrapped in the same thing. So then eventually when I deal with CSS and JavaScript, I know I will be treating them the same way. Okay. Alternatively, you have an ID. So if you have like one particular thing, like some main attraction or some like only the homepage logo or something, that you would be able to utilize an ID for. So an ID would be something where you just want to, like, this is the only thing that exists in my system of HTML of this, and I want to specify it individually. Okay, you're not going to have multiple elements on a web page with the same ID. that would be antithetical to what the purpose of an ID is, right? But a class, like the same way, right? We're a class of students, right? So we would all have class equals students, right? And but then there's only one, like, oh, Google? Not right now. There's not, like, there's only one, like, presenter or projector, right? The projector would have an ID, for example. Does that make some sense? At the same time. Whereas a class, you can say, like, these are multiples of the same thing. I wanted them to behave the same way, or be styled the same way, or that kind of thing, structured the same way. Okay, so that's how you would utilize any attributes that you need to deal with. What is going on here? So some global attributes that are really cool are like hidden, content editable, style, title, language, and then that data dash star is something that you'll see further along when we get into React, but it's like a customizable data attribute that you can use to do a lot of cool stuff, even with just plain JavaScript and CSS. Okay, so every element inherently holds some default information, some default attributes or properties, okay? Some elements are inherently block elements, and some are inherently inline elements, okay? So when you have a block element, like a div or an H1, for example, they're gonna take up all the space they can from the one side of the page to the other. So they'll break out onto a new line and they'll take up all the space. So I'm taking up the whole block. I'm a block element, okay? Whereas an inline element is just gonna take up as much space as needed. It's gonna say, like, okay, I started here, I only need to take up this much space and that's all I need. And then if somebody else wants to, you know, set up next to me, that's totally fine. Okay, so this is the difference between a block element and an inline element. So some are inherent. Now, granted, when we get into CSS, you will be able to have the ability, you will be able to change the inherent nature of an element, but it should be important to know firsthand what you're going to deal with in the first place, right? So that you don't have to make any changes if you don't need to, right? So in this case, a paragraph is the one that's useful to know. A paragraph is a block element, whereas a span element is an inline element. So paragraph and span are oftentimes utilized in a very similar fashion. They're both utilized for some set of text. Okay, they're usually for sets of text content, and you can put a span inside of a paragraph, and it's not going to, like, break up that that paragraph into, like, a separate space. Sure. So, for example, if I have a paragraph here, and I put this in there, okay? And then I have, here is one paragraph, and my link is here, whereas I can do the same thing.
And inline, that A anchor is inline, that's what that means, it's like them within the block elements.
So, actually, let's do it this way. You're right, here's one paragraph, and so the idea is that you would think, because it's a paragraph and this is an A tag, whereas this, oh. Okay, so I'm going to move, okay, so I'm making a span paragraph. Here is one span. Okay, so I'm making a paragraph element and a span element. And at the end, I'm putting the anchor tag. Okay? So what we should expect is that the paragraph element should kick off this anchor tag and put it on a new line. It doesn't want to sit with the anchor tag. Whereas a span is like, that's cool, you can just sit next to me. That should be what happens. Let's find out. Okay, so here we also see that an anchor tag is also inline. So we have our first part. Here's one paragraph, and I'm taking up all the space. Nobody can sit with me. Okay, and then your anchor tag is an inline element, so that it sits on the next line. Okay, it takes up only as much space as it's needed, and then the next element can sit next to me. So that's the span tag, and then after that was the following anchor tag that I expected to sit next to the span.
So spans are used for embedded and hyperlinks within a paragraph.
Spans are used for all kinds of different things, but it's important to note that if I expected this paragraph to, like, so for me to be able to have multiple paragraphs sitting right next to each other, that's not going to happen. It's going to take up its space, and then that next paragraph is going to be on a new line, which makes sense if you think about the way a paragraph is structured on any given page, right? You have a paragraph block and then like a space, and it creates, the new paragraph is like a whole new space, right? You wouldn't really expect a paragraph to run on right next to the previous paragraph. So it aligns with the way that we expect that kind of functionality to work in real life, right? Where I don't think we have any equivalent for a span, but this is where the behavior of a block element versus an inline element, okay? So it takes up just as much space the content needs, and that's it. Whereas a block is like, I'm taking up the whole line to the width that I have accessible to me. Okay? All right, so continue presenting. All right, so yeah, let's get into this part. So we just talked about the idea that some element is able to like just say like, I want all the space. We can see elements right now as a box, okay? So any beginning caret to the end caret in itself is a box, okay? The way things are nested, you can have boxes within boxes and that kind of thing, but any given element is, you can think of it like a box, okay? Every element will hold these types of properties. So padding, border, margin, and position, okay? And if you've ever looked at your Chrome DevTools, you might have seen this thing hanging out on the side of your Chrome DevTools, right? This thing is saying for any given highlighted element, these are the box settings that are being applied, okay? So the inner blue box is the actual content, okay? So it's like the super inside part is the actual content that's being displayed or not displayed or whatever, right? From there, you get into padding. Padding is the definition of the space between the content and the edge of the box, okay? So it's like, how much space do I want between like me content and like the edge of like the packaging that I live in, okay? From there, you get to border. Border is the actual like border line between my, element existing, okay? So the border is the actual like edge of my element existing. Okay. From there, you get to margin. So margin is the distance between you as an element and the next element. How much space, like if that span tag and the A tag, like, do they really need to be like directly next to each other? How much margin do I want to give the A tag from sitting next to the span tag? Okay. Is that a lot of personal space? Is it a tiny bit of space, right? Like that's what it is there. The way I like to explain it is like the content is like the contents in your stomach, right? The padding is like your thickness between like your contents of your stomach and your body thickness, okay? Your border is like your skin, okay? It's like, this is where I end. This is my border, okay? And then my margin is the distant, like my personal space between me and John, like this is our margin, right? And then the position is the space I'm taking up in the room relative to the room. So I'm over here in the corner, Rod's over there in that corner, right? Okay, so that's the way we're lining up when it comes to the entire room. Make sense? And then like, however much you ate this morning, that's your content.
And they've got like, so like all these websites out there now that, you know, Foursquare, like whatever it is, you can like write content on it and then click and like drag the position and like, develop the padding and all that stuff, but it's not like sort of do it for you.
Oh, Squarespace?
What did I say?
Oh, it's Squarespace. Yeah, Foursquare. I was like, Foursquare is doing what now? Yeah, so like when you deal with things that are like what you see is what you get and whatnot, and they want to help you figure out like what your what you want your boxes to end up looking like,
Yeah.
right? They're helping you make those decisions.
Yes. Yeah.
Without explaining like, what do you want your margin to be? Like any given person's not going to be like, I know what margin is. Additionally, we see percentage signs here. Okay, so we can give this properties when we'll talk about CSS, but you're going to be talking about like pixels or view widths and view height. And that's like all extra stuff that like a given person who just wants they just want their business to be on the internet, right? Like they're not going to be wanting to deal with like whether it should be pixels or view height. You know, so for them that's extrapolated. I mean, it's what's the word? Abstracted, right? It's abstracted to just be like, how big do you want this? How thin do you want this, right? Do you want a black border on it? Do you want a white border on it? A green border, right? So that's the stuff that's happening on the CSS end by manipulating the HTML elements, okay? So how do I get started with this? So I'm glad that I showed you a little bit of examples, but typically you start with this like ugliness kind of stuff going on. You think you can do it from multiple sides, right? You can think like, okay, what am I trying to display? How do I name those things? Just like we dealt with when we're dealing with our Ruby applications, right? Start from the big picture. Like, what nouns am I using? What should I be naming things? What should exist in these things? How should I expect them to behave? Okay, same thing goes with HTML. You're typically going to, any given page is going to have pretty much these elements, and these HTML elements are here to support you like doing this, okay? You're typically going to have some kind of header, and one thing I will note is a header. This is all these things that are shown right here to you are living in what's called the body. So a document body is what's going to be shown to the user, okay? There's another section above that that is not shown to the user. Does anybody know what that's called? Somebody, oh, I was like, somebody whispered it. It's the head, okay? So it's like the stuff in my mind, I'm just gonna like, I'm gonna like, Vulkan mind meld it to you, and then the browser needs to know, that's it. And then the browser will show you what's actually going on in the body.
So I'm assuming it's important for the front end and back end team to sort of have continuity as far as naming convention is concerned, so that whatever's popped up here is actually, so they're all like referring to the same thing.
Oftentimes, yes, that's what's going to end up coming into play. That's a lot of times where either having a full stack experience or being able to have a really good like connected team, it really comes into play. Making sure that you have like some understanding, especially when it gets to actually when we get into React, like all that stuff ends up being like super important because you're naming things are actually going to be things that exist in your HTML and CSS. Okay. But for now, here are a few more HTML elements that you should be aware of. Header stuff, like anything that's just like the top should be in a header tag. Your navigation, your nav bar stuff is going to be in a nav tag. Okay. You have what is called a section tag. And that's usually where you're just setting up like, these are all of my sections of things that are happening. You have a main tag that really says like, this is like the main set of content that's going to be delivered to this person. Everything else might be like a larger shell that's templated out, for example. Like this web page might look like this on 20 different pages, but the content might be different. So this is the main differentiator that of content that's going to be different. And then you have article tag. You have an aside tag that just says like, here's some stuff on the side that's not directly relevant to the main content, but is important to show. And then you have a footer tag. That'll be like the footer stuff that ends up at the bottom of any given website, right? It's pretty typical understanding of what any website you've gone to looks like. There are corresponding HTML elements that help the browser understand what's going on. Okay. And then we mentioned too, like we have two articles here. They both have H1s in them. Okay, so that's one instance where you would utilize an H1, which is like the heading of this particular section. Okay, but you wouldn't put an H1, for example, you wouldn't put two H1s inside this main div or inside this main HTML element. Does that make sense? Like it should be one of each, or like only one H1, only one H2.
But there could be a single H1 in main ID.
A single one, yes. Yeah. Okay, so this is like on the HTML side once. Now I'm going to get coding after I've figured out the sketch part of what I expect to do. Okay. This is the HTML part. So these are the main pieces that you're going to need in just about every single web page that you look at. If you go to any single website, you can right-click, look at their source code. They're going to have these elements in there, and probably like a billion more, but these are like the most necessary basic ones. Okay, the first thing you set is this doc type. It tells the browser that you're using HTML5. Okay, we'll probably get into like the history of HTML when Chris comes in and talks about HTTP, because there's some like relevance to like how documents got exchanged on the internet. But we are utilizing HTML5. That is now the standard, and there's actually HTML 5.1 standards coming into play now. So it's something to keep in mind. Every language, including HTML, is a living, breathing language. Okay, there are people suggesting new things, giving new sets for requirements. So please do keep in mind that things deprecate, right? Things go out of use. You might see old stuff, new stuff, all that stuff. It's just going to continue growing. HTML itself is a tag that just wraps, like, here's where my HTML starts, and then you say, like, okay, I'm done, right? It's good for the browser just to know when you're done, pretty much. Okay? Then you have this head, okay? So the head is, if you think about any given letter, right? You have the heading part where it's like, this is from this company on this date for this person, it was for this reason, right? That is the equivalent to HTML's head, right? It's just information that the browser needs to know in order to make sure that we're all on the same page, okay? Pun not intended, okay? Then you have the letter body, right? That's like the stuff that the person is supposed to actually read and, consider and whatnot, right? That's the body of your HTML. That's all the stuff that's going to be shown to the user, okay? So that's where you have like a paragraph tag and whatnot, okay? There's one here at the bottom before the end of the body, and that's called the script. A script tag is basically a way for you either to directly write JavaScript or link to a JavaScript file, so that your JavaScript is read after all the HTML has been put on the page. And we'll talk in more detail why that's important when we talk about JavaScript. But you'll see script HTML elements usually at the bottom of your body. And you're wondering, like, why does that not show up? It's because it's a script tag. Question.
So when you're creating like basic websites, right? Like, so we've been working on a project, we've got a bunch of files, we're like coding all the back end stuff. When you actually want to integrate that into the website, like you're parsing it from your file into the script portion of the website to say, hey, right here, I want to like count apples, and just continue parsing it throughout the.
So it'll be a combination of either that stuff happening on the server side and some of that stuff happening on the client side. And the way you make decisions about what frameworks you should utilize will help determine how much of that information gets done on the server side and just pulled, like, should I just send 43 from the server, or should I calculate 43 on the client side? That's where React and when Rod was speaking a little more about like logic happening on the client side, that's where that stuff comes into play. Okay. Other question? Say it again.
For this script tag, like you have only one, or you can have like multiple.
Good question. So it depends. Everything it depends answer. Okay. When you are writing scripts, you would usually just use one script tag and just put everything inside of that. If you're referencing other libraries, you could have referencing multiple libraries, right? So you would have like a script line that says, go to this JavaScript, download it, go to this JavaScript, download it, go to that JavaScript, download it. You might also see multiple, like if you look at any, like a Google, even google.com or something, you might see like multiple like script chunks at the bottom of the page. And those might have been generated on the server side and then like pushed over in the HTML to render.
Okay. How they gonna run based on the sequence, like you put the
it'll run in sequence. So we'll talk about how JavaScript will render on a page in a few days, but for now, know that the browser will read everything from top to bottom. So it starts here and it's like, oh, cool, we're gonna do HTML5 today. That's awesome. So then, all right, here's where it starts. All right, head, what do I need to know? What do I need to go get? Do I need to go get those pictures? Do I need to go get those CSS things? Do I need to go get whatever? What should I put on the tab when this thing loads? What should I tell Twitter if they want to show this to Twitter? What should I show Facebook? What should I, all that stuff. All that stuff happens in the head. And then it starts going into like, okay, I need to go get this. Okay, I need to go get this. And then it renders everything on the page. And then when it gets towards the end, it's like, okay, JavaScript, you're taking over on the show. So then it goes and does all of the JavaScript stuff to the HTML document that was loaded by the browser. Okay. So your script tags are where your JavaScript stuff is going to go. What I didn't specify here is this link tag here. Link is where you're going to specify the CSS and other types of external resources that you need to go and get in order for the HTML page to be loaded appropriately. So remember the other day when John showed everyone a page, but it looked like really broken and there were like no images? Y'all remember? We downloaded the HTML and then there were images that were just like not there, even though we expected them to be there. It was because those links that the HTML browser wanted to go point to and get and bring down, it couldn't find it. So I was like, I'm moving on. I can't find it. I'm moving on. And then it just showed what it could at the time based on, what instructions we gave it through HTML.
That's where it's reaching back into the back end to like pull the stuff you have saved somewhere in a database.
So so reaching out to back end, meaning like either the server that it came from or other sources. So the other servers in the cloud, for example, right? Like it could be your server that it should be getting it from, or it could be other sources that are in other servers pointed to in other places, okay? But that's link element are where you're going to make those instructions, okay?
And you said the link is connected to the CSS, like the CSS style or something. The link.
Yeah, that would be similar to when you do require relative, right? Like you're requiring these libraries or these other pages or these other resources to be brought in before for the page to render appropriately. Okay, so
when you're using JavaScript, you're only operating on stuff within you're operating on like HTML, right?
yes.
So you're not actually like you wouldn't.
That's database stuff too. For right
for,
now, yeah.
for right now, yeah.
For right now.
Yeah.
Later on the others, it's much more. JavaScript can do much more than just all the stuff with HTML. But we'll worry about that in a later point. Right now,
Yeah.
we just want to focus on
Friday, you'll get all the deal. But for now, let's focus on HTML. So HTML is the main show for today. Okay. So one cool thing I will show you. I have Emmet. So one thing I know, if any of you have Emmet, you can do this exclamation mark and then tab. Pow. That's the basic general thing I need for every time I need to build a web page, right? And then you would add things from there. But one thing you would add is, for example, if I'm on this folder called My First Web Page, I have an index.html. Just erase that because it's doing too much. I have index.html, and you're pretty much always going to see like your root web page being called index.html. It's kind of because your index.html is basically like the root to your tree of pages, and everything else would be relative to that root page. Okay, pretty much everything you deal with in the world of programming is like, let's think of it like a tree, and there's nodes to the tree, right? And everything's related, and I know I can get to it from some root. Okay, so it's built just like a directory. Okay, so I have my index.html.
And sometimes you use HTML is working.
HTML and HTML are the same. You can utilize that interchangeably. I don't remember why specifically there's both HTML and HTML, but just know that if you accidentally forgot the L on your HTML, it should still load in the browser and be fine.
Because usually the format like the extension is only extension format like .com.
Oh, maybe that's why. But that's not the case now. There are a lot of top level domains that are like .company, .pizza, .party. So that doesn't matter anymore, but I can see where that might have come into play. But there's like .co, .jp, right? Those were 2 characters, not 3. So, but regardless of that, a .html file is an HTML document. It's going to be interpreted by the browser, and it's also going to create it as an object. But we'll talk about how it's an object in JavaScript on Friday. But for now, just know that this is a document, an HTML document, okay? So again, we start saying like, this is the HTML. These are siblings. This is a head tag, okay? So I'm saying like, this is the stuff that I need the browser to know before we get started, okay? A title tag is basically what's gonna end up showing up my new site, okay? So whatever I write in title is gonna be what shows up in the tab space, okay? So I'll show you right now, but the other thing we would wanna do is set up a link. So the link is relating to our style sheet. We don't really need type anymore, but it's something that gets utilized. Like it's like a default that is gonna eventually be deprecated, but we don't need it. But href, again, is hyperlink reference. So I'm referring to, it's kind of like require relative, the way we utilize that in Ruby, okay? So I'm saying go point, like go get my CSS from this place, okay? And so for this instance, we're just gonna put style.css. Note that it's going to say like, okay, style.css, because I'm in the same folder, I should be able to find a file called style.css in the same folder as me. Okay. Otherwise, you know, if it's something external where I have to make an HTTP request, a GET request, okay, I would use HTTP protocol www dot, this is where my link is .com, right? Okay, and then body. So right now, if I just show this right now in the browser, okay, so if you notice on the 4th tab, this is what we're looking at. So you see, what does it say? My new site, woo woo. Oh, it's kind of hard to see.
Where did you see that?
But if you look, if tab 4,
Oh, the tab. Okay.
okay, I don't have.
That's where the head goes.
So it's not where the head goes, it's where the title goes. So this is that title tag I wrote, my new site. Okay, so again, when I didn't have any title, it just defaulted the title to be the name of the page. It was just like, oh, okay, I'm just going to show you this page. It's named index.html, so it just shows index.html. So the browser probably makes that decision.
Can I see the code one more time?
Sure.
My new site was. So I thought the head was supposed to be what we're like telling.
Yes, you're right. So this is the head,
It
right?
does show up only in the title sense.
So the only thing that shows up from this whole list of things in the head is the title, but it doesn't show up in the document. It shows up at the tab level to represent what the document is.
That's just Chrome's interpretation.
It's Chrome's interpretation of the title. Okay?
Cool. Okay.
So you can also put, like, I think there's also like a description tag, like, but this is, again, it's the stuff where if you wanted to, like, no, actually that would be a meta. So you'd have meta, like, description equals
So what is
a
I missed
new
what meta was.
site that I built. Okay, so meta is a type of HTML tag that lets you give information about the document that's not going to be shown to the user. So it gets utilized in lots of different ways. The main part that you would utilize it for is like setting, like we're going to be using UTF as our character set, right? We're gonna, and then you could say things like,
Is in font.
there are other attributes you can utilize for meta that you can learn more specifically about today in one of our challenges, for example. Okay, I would definitely challenge you, if anybody is interested at least about meta, to like look at meta and see all the attributes you can put in meta. Okay, it gets utilized a lot, so that's a really valuable tag to learn about. But any meta tag is going to be like, you know, hey browser, let me tell you some information before you display this document. That's basically what meta is doing. Okay, and then after head's closed, body shows up and shows what's going on to the user. Okay, so right now when I showed you my page, there's nothing in it, right? Super blank body, right? Why? I didn't put anything in here, right? Okay, so if I put like, if I put a div in here, should anything show up? No, right? Why? Because there's no content. Okay, unless I put hello.
What was div? What did that say again?
Div stands for, it means divider. Okay, and it's an HTML element that's pretty ubiquitous, meaning like it doesn't really have a particular meaning. So some of the things I showed you before, oh no, it should be in here.
So you can put paragraph or header at the same time.
It would have done a little bit different things. So if, for example, we put div hello. So let's change this to h1. Okay, now this is what it looked like. Oh wait, no, I was in the right. Okay, this is what it looked like before. Okay, now if I refresh it, boom, hello, even louder.
Oh, because there's a default for the header.
There is a default set of CSS, which could segue into my next one, but we'll do a break. It's CSS that's being applied because of the element type. Question?
Yeah, can you go back to the code for a second?
Yes.
I think you spoke about this earlier, and I just don't remember. How come there are no like closing? Like over here, you'll have a body, but to close it with, but you don't have that here for link and meta.
Good question. Because meta and link are self-closing tags. So there are a set of tags that some of them just close by themselves. They don't need a ending. Partly because there's no content that's going to be utilized here. Meta just takes attributes and does its thing. Link takes a link and does its thing. Okay, there's no real user content that's going to be wedged between the beginning of this tag and the end of this tag that requires an ending tag.
So is that the rule of thumb going forward? If there's content involved, then it's probably going to require a tag, closing tag.
Yeah, you can utilize that. We're going to utilize CSS or HTML reference that'll give you an understanding of. It's pretty much like you practice it enough and you understand which are self-closing and which are not. It's not going to break if you have tried to. I don't think it's going to break. Yeah, if you try and make a closing tag, it won't break on you necessarily. So this one, for example, I should have probably put that, but it didn't. Like, they're not like super necessary, but it might help you semantically to be like, okay, this closes by itself. So this is the beginning of me and the end of me at the same time. Whereas you can see clearly, like, this is an end HTML to this beginning HTML.
And the other ones you could also do like less than / meta, like at the end. It's like a full-on closing. You know, and the ones you put just a slash, but you can actually put the whole thing in there and it'll be fine.
I think so, but we'll find out. And then after we find out, okay, I got no errors. Word. Okay, so, and again, see, we see at the bottom we have, so this is the content. It's an H1, so it takes up all the space that it wants. So if I move this bigger or smaller, see how that number changes? It's like all the space I can take up, I'm taking all of it. Okay, and then there's some user agent style sheets default by the browser telling us that an H1 should have a set margin. Okay, and it should have no border and no padding. But it's whatever space it takes up, all the width. It's going to take up all the width.
Where do you enter, like, padding border?
We'll talk about that next in CSS. But for now, I just want to show you like the players that are happening when you just write just plain HTML. Okay. Cool. Break time. All right, let me